Hi there. My name is Chris Lloyd-Jones. I'm head of Open Technologies at Avanade. I'm also on the steering committee of the Green Software Foundation. I'm here with Lonneke Driessen from the Open Charge Alliance. And we're going to talk to you about the blueprints that OpenUK have been producing. So that's previously the Patchwork Kilt blueprint for open data centers, circular and renewable data centers. And then the newest blueprint that we're about to launch following State of OpenCon, which is the EV charging blueprint. So I'm going to set some context on what a blueprint is and why we make them. And then Lonneke and I are going to talk a little bit more about the work of the Open Charge Alliance, the the charge point protocol the Open Charge Alliance has been producing, and why standards are important for this particular area.
There's no file on here?
There should be a PDF.
No, but there's nothing on the USB.
We may or may not have a copy of the blueprint to show. We'll see, but if not, we'll continue.
Is it on the interwebs?
Yes.
It's nothing to do with the video. There's no presentation.
Just open it on the laptop.
I see.
That's what I'm saying. But I can just download it from my email if you want. I can open it.
Oh, this is your machine.
No, it's not.
It's still John's.
Sorry, minor issue there.
Sorry about this.
That's my fault.
Is it on the webs? We can also...
It is. I can send you a link. It's okay if not. We'll just talk through it. We'll attach the slides to the CVent afterwards, so you can download the PDF just in the interest of time. But a blueprint is, well, it's a very common term, but in OpenUK, a blueprint is something which we've developed to try and analyze a particular area, particularly relating to sustainability, to identify key components of a particular industry, segment, or sector. So for the Patchwork Kilt, that was to identify all the components and pieces that form part of a data center, like the Open Compute project. I will say I was not part of that blueprint, so I'm not as familiar. The newest blueprint was kicked off in July of last year, and working with BEIS, the newly defunct government ministry as of yesterday, the Scottish Futures Trust, the Welsh Assembly Government, the Northern Irish Executive, Intel, Microsoft, and tons of other partners, we've identified what people think the key themes are in the space of EV charging. So that is, how do we focus on circularity and sustainability? How do we engage local communities? How do we collaborate across these sectors to improve energy infrastructure, to support charge point operators and connectivity, to make sure that EV charging supports the local community, to make sure that regulatory and planning policy takes into account rural density, cities, highways, how people might want to charge their vehicles, and finally, end user services. For the current battery technology, which takes some time, how do we make sure the services are there to keep people engaged and happy and able to travel from point to point? So Lonneke, if you'd like to come up and talk a little bit about the Open Charge Alliance and the Charge Point Protocol, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the blueprints and what we've been working on.
Yeah, sure. So, hello everybody. My name is Lonneke Driessen, and I work for a non-profit organization based in the Netherlands called the Open Charge Alliance. So in 2009, one of the founding members of the Open Charge Alliance decided to install charging stations in the Netherlands to kickstart the market. Back in those days, there were hardly any vehicles available, and there were certainly no charging stations. And to solve this chicken and egg problem, this company, ELAT, just installed 3,000 charging stations all across the Netherlands. And of course, from day one, they had this mindset that they wanted to have a multiple vendor network, and they wanted to use a standard. And they asked the charging station vendors back then if they had a sort of standard protocol to communicate with the backend system, and there was nothing. So then ELAT said, well, if there's nothing, we'll just start writing something ourselves. And since the main purpose of this market is that it should grow, why not give it away as open source? So that's when the protocol OCPP started, an open source standard, which very simply, it's not rocket science, it just describes the information exchange to a charging station. And since it was so early days, there was not a lot around, everybody started using it, and at a certain time, it became such a broadly adopted protocol that the company ELAT decided to hand it over to a non-profit organization called the Open Charge Alliance. and this was in 2014. Since then, the whole EV charging market has grown significantly. The EV market has grown, and now with the pledges from European governments, American governments, Korean governments, that actually encourage the transition to zero-emission transportation, the adoption of our open source standard has also grown. So currently, we are used by a lot of organizations in a lot of different countries. The standard itself is open source in the sense that you can just use it, download it for free. There's no IP in it, of course, no licensing barriers or whatsoever. Some companies actually develop open source code for a charging station. So if you're building a station, you can just use their open source code. But there are also a lot of companies who have their own software and have a different business model. But the standard itself is all open source code, and we're really happy with the decision that was made, I think 13 years ago, to go open source from day one.
Yeah, and Lonneke came on board very early on in this initiative. And one of the reasons why Lonneke is on board and why other organizations are starting to work with us is because the aim of a blueprint is to analyze a particular sector. And I mentioned that already. But the reason why we do that is we often find there are gaps in the sector. So there are services which aren't being addressed or metrics which aren't being considered. So all of our stakeholders took part in a series of workshops from July through to November, where we identified primary stakeholders, secondary stakeholders, and we started to map out all of the interactions between various bodies in this industry. For example, the EV charging operators, they provide designs for open source hardware plans. We find here they share status updates with local planning sectors in some areas. We've got organizations like the Open Charge Alliance who provide the standards for these charge points to share data with the energy grid, with the vehicle, with other vendors. But once you identify all the various stakeholders, once you start to identify the various use cases, and I mentioned earlier on the key themes of circularity, local economy, and collaboration, you can start to identify key themes, key reasons to actually collaborate around open source standards and initiatives. And then we can identify where the open source community is maybe underserved, where there are gaps in the infrastructure, where there is software or data which is missing, which then can lead us to engage with other bodies to try and resolve problems. So Lonneke and I were chatting yesterday, and we were chatting about the adoption of electric vehicle charging in the United States. And you were telling me about how standards are or are not supporting the adoption of electric vehicle charging in the United States versus in Europe. So while I move on to the key themes, I don't know if you want to discuss that a little bit more and describe the problems there.
Yeah, so this is something that so I never realized, and I'm encountering it now, and I've learned that it is an issue for all different areas in open source. Is initially the industry, consumers, certain companies were promoting EV charging or electric vehicle adoption in general. And what you see is more and more governments are mandating transition to zero-emission vehicles as of 2035 or whatever. 2030 sort of depends on which country around the planet. And in order to push that a bit further, governments are also starting to put in place legislation, regulation, and also mandating standards. At the moment, the standards that they mandate are not a mandate in general, but just a prerequisite to get government funding. So you don't have to use a standard network infrastructure, but if you want to get government funding, then you have to implement standards. And what we see that, for instance, the Korean government has mandated this, our open standard OCPP for government funding. OCPP is not a formal standard. It's not set by ISO or IEC or IEEE. We're just one non-profit organization, but the Korean government is fine with that, and they are mandating OCPP. Same goes for the American government, the California government, but also the US federal government. If you want to be eligible for government funding, and there is a lot of government funding becoming available in the United States this year and in the years to come. Also, OCPP is a requirement, even though OCPP is not a formal standard. But the situation is very different in Europe. The European Commission, as we are being told, and we're still looking for the exact document and place where it is written explicitly, states that the only standard the European government can mandate are ISO standard or IEC standards. And we keep asking why, and the answer is, well, because that's what we always do. And therefore, they will not consider OCPP as a standard in Europe unless we hand over our standards to either ISO or IEC.
So to reframe that another way, the US has a very mature charging infrastructure, or it's maturing quite rapidly. And when we look across the key themes that we identified from our research, energy infrastructure, regulatory and planning, vehicle infrastructure, end user services, charging operation connectivity, and then community engagement, that leads us to be able to identify a set of high-level components which any mature market, we think, based on our research, needs for EV charging to actually roll out at scale, at pace, without prejudicing any one group or community. Now, the OSPP would fit into the charging operators category and the regulatory and planning category as it's a standard. So then we can identify gap analysis where by geography, some of these components might be missing or might not be fully realized, and therefore an open source community can step in. So at the end of the state of OpenCon, we'll be releasing this high-level document, the blueprint which comes after it, because this was the initial planning, and the data sets to actually show where, based upon this research, we've identified regions that might have particular gaps. For example, Scottish Futures Trust is the body taking over EV charging points in Scotland. And some of the concerns that they've mentioned is that Scotland effectively set up EV charging points that were subsidised and run by the state government. Now, when the market needs to expand, what has happened is that the government, through over-focusing on regulatory and planning, has somewhat distorted the market. And that means that other players, other charge point operators and connectivity providers don't want to step in. So again, the aim of this blueprint is to identify various different options, various different components that any mature geography needs to have for electric vehicle charging to be adopted. And this now, I think, leads me on to the standards conversations. You're mentioning about ISO standards, EC standards. Now, there aren't many standards in the world which are both open source and supported by standards organizations. And Lonneke, I know you mentioned there have been some issues with yourself. Could you just explain a little bit some of the problems that ELAD's had in engaging as an energy provider and as the Open Charge Alliance with bodies like the European Commission and others?
Yeah, so the way OCPP was developed, not made intentionally, but sort of organically, was in 2009. We wrote the first version of the protocol, and it got implemented, it got tested, and over the years we learned and improved and added more functionality and features to the protocol. So sort of in an agile way, say every 3 years there was an updated version. And every version that was available was not perfect, and there were issues in it, and they were incomplete. But the next version, step by step, added more features. And this is, of course, very logical, because back in 2009, we could never have imagined how the market would develop. So in a very rapidly and diversely developing market, having such an agile way of developing a standard makes perfect sense. At ISO and IEC, though, we have been told extensively that this is not the way you develop a standard. The way you develop a standard is first you think of use cases. So what is the use case that you're trying to serve? And then afterwards you define an information model. So what does a charging station look like? And once you know what a charging station looks like, which component, then you define messages. And you don't define messages just like that. You define them in alignment with already existing standards that connect to this standard. So those three components we think are not the way we approach things, and not the best way to approach things. So first of all, think of use cases. In a very mature market, you know what you want to use it for. But in EV charging, over the past decade, you didn't really know what use cases, what market developments, what business cases would apply. So it's a sort of an impossibility to, say in 2015, think out all the use cases for the next decade. The second part, what does a charging station look like? So what are the information components? You don't know. Will it have one socket, two cables? Will it have a cloud connection? Will it have, it's too early in the market to define a fixed information model for a charging station. And the last one, the sequence of thinking it out and aligning it with existing standards. This makes the whole development of a standard very political, because there are already standards in place and business interests in place and IP in place. And if it doesn't match perfectly, they will start arguing for for their case, and not thinking greenfield, what is it that the industry actually needs. Yeah. So there's sort of a fundamental discussion we keep having with ISO and IEC that the way we do things is wrong. So we thought, well, okay, fine. So we just continue with our open source standard, and it's very successful, we might add. And so that's good enough for us. So we're happy never to become an ISO or an IEC standard. So that's not our aim, so we're fine.
So Lonneke was describing a number of the problems there with one of these particular components, with how we make sure that the standard itself is open sourced, adopted then by more formal standard agencies to allow a particular geography like the European Union, European Commission to mandate this across Europe. I talked earlier about the United States and about how they have adopted OCPP and how they are already using that standard across the United States. In a session this morning, we had Leanne Kemp from Australia talking about similar initiatives there. But the idea here is that these blueprints we're releasing provide a menu of components which we need, which I've already said, in order for a particular sector to be improved. So we can identify where there might be gaps in some geographies, but not others. And I mention this to all of you because the data sets behind this are going to be released, and what we're looking for is for the open source community to review what we've made, to identify where there might be gaps, and work with us as we now move on from the theoretical data analysis, the generation of a high-level blueprint, to identify where there might be projects which could sit with existing open source communities like LF Energy, like the Green Software Foundation, like automotive grade Linux, to actually then build out these gaps and share the knowledge. So that was all I had to say on the blueprint. Before we open up for any questions around what a blueprint is, why we're releasing it, or how you might get involved, are there any final points or takeaways you want to add about OCPP?
Just a takeaway. I think we're really happy that we opted for the open source approach back in 2009. It's been really successful, and it's already helped this market develop a lot. Not just that, almost every charging station is running on Linux, just very simply. I think a lot of people don't really realize or consider that they're using open source and what it is able to do for them. So it was before I joined this development, but I'm really happy that the people who started it back in 2009 said, let's go open source from day one.
So with that, I'll close for questions. If there are any questions about OpenEV charging, the standard, or how you might get involved, please feel free. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So do we have questions?
I have a question. Who of you already drives an EV? Oh, good. And?
Don't have an issue. So I use the Tesla supercharging network and charge at home mostly. So although I'm aware of the issues around incompatibility of the payment process between charging providers in the UK, I'm not suffering the issues because I've purchased a vehicle that's got more than 300 miles, and because of where we personally travel, that is more than enough so that we don't have to use charging networks.
So this is a real good example. Yeah. So you have, of course, Tesla. We all love Tesla because basically if it weren't for Tesla, none of this movement would have really taken off. It's just that Tesla is showing that it can be done. It's a great car, and it can also be very profitable. Tesla is a very highly valued company. The thing is that with this sort of Tesla, everything's proprietary. It's their own charging network. It's everything their own plug. It's all one brand, which is great. If you look more into the future and more diversity and different brands, then of course you need to go to interoperability. And there, of course, the Tesla approach, while it's a very good approach, but it's the scalability of not everybody can own and drive a Tesla or charge it.
Exactly. When we were talking about this yesterday, one of the key problems we had is that Tesla, the Polestars, the BMWs and the Porsches and the other vehicles of the world, yes, they may have either access to proprietary networks like Tesla or be able to support a much greater charging range. But how does that ensure the majority of society at an affordable price point can move to these vehicles? So part of this is to ensure that wherever you are, if you live in a rural area outside a big city, if you're living above the breadline, you might need to be buying a vehicle which has been refurbished or renewed, that you aren't cut out by virtue of your job, your location, or your access to funds for these vehicles. Tesla's a great network, but we're also trying to make sure that everyone else is involved.
Yeah, it's like a great Kickstarter, but The whole planet cannot depend on the Tesla charging network.
One other point.
Yeah.
I know that in the Netherlands, Tesla was able to then, allow access to other vehicles and other groups to use their charging network, which I believe has happened in the UK in some small way. It's really interesting the way you've spoken about it. After your Glasgow speech, I then contacted my MP about this issue in the UK, and so this is a few years ago now.
2 years.
And they were saying, and he got information back from the minister in charge in the UK government to say, yeah, we're dealing with this, and we're going to fix it. What's happened? I'm interested to know what's happened in the UK.
So again, BEIS, as of yesterday, now defunct, and we haven't yet reconvened with their contacts to find out what that'll mean for this project. But the Cabinet Office, the Geographical Information, I can't remember what the S stands for, the GIS team within the Cabinet Office and the Equipment Cost Scotland and the like are working on this project. They're actually providing a large amount of the data for where EV charging points are sited, for whether they are in rural or non-rural areas, and also they're engaged in setting standards for end consumers based upon some of the work in the blueprint, for example, mandating that chargers must have a certain amount of uptime. They're looking for around 95, 96, which I think is slightly lower than in the Netherlands. And they're also looking at ensuring that these EV chargers take card payments. Because to date, if you look at petrol pumps, there is very strict regulation on pricing, how you show the price, how you charge, the fact that petrol pumps need to be maintained. None of that consumer protection exists for consumer regulation, so this blueprint is helping to address some of those issues through engagement with these bodies as well.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yep.
I think we had another question over there.
Yep, got a couple of,
Wait, just like, wait for the mic. Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Okay.
So sorry, mine was just an intervention because it wasn't necessarily about network of charging points in the city, but especially at home as well. The fact that the providers are quite behind when you think that they're probably using them for themselves and they're probably putting in features that are quite basic. And I'm quite surprised to see that for something that seems to be doing a function that's so basic, the provider I'm using, for example, actually doesn't go far at all. So I can see where open source really could help bring basic functionalities to the homes. But so I withdrew my question because this is about the home rather than.
But I think basically EV chargers in my industry it's very important. But basically, and I don't like it if I say it, but basically just sort of a glorified plug, right? There's nothing more. And there's a display. And sometimes you could use the RFID card of your mobile phone to pay. It's like that's all. And it sends back information about when you started charging and when to stop. So it's really simple. So I think all these issues that we're facing have nothing to do with technology or the state of technology as of today. It's just...
Because the standard does allow for some of the things that you're describing as well. And part of the discussion we've actually had with some of the energy companies that are forming part of this as well that don't have their permission to mention at the moment. They are also talking about how they might use electric vehicle batteries to help manage the grid, to make them smarter so they can support energy grids in the local area, to store energy from renewable generation on the tops of houses, from wind and the like, and then also to generally reduce e-waste and identify where local chargers might be able to be shared in the neighbourhood as well.
Yeah.
So,
thank you.
Any other questions? No. That said, I'll be around on booth on floor 1 if anyone's got any other questions, and the Open Charge Alliance are on floor 4 if you'd like to actually see the standard or dive into it in more detail. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.